I agreed to the camping trip for reasons I did not explain to anyone, not even to myself. My uncle Daniel framed it as a harmless weekend away, a chance to disconnect, breathe clean air, and sit beside a fire without notifications or expectations. I said yes because it felt easier than admitting how heavy everything had become at home. At 26, I was employed, stable, and quietly exhausted by a life that looked complete from the outside. I needed distance, and the woods offered a polite excuse. Daniel invited two of his closest friends, Lucas Bennett and Mark Bennett, a couple he had known for years. They arrived together in a dusty SUV, moving with the ease of people long accustomed to one another. Mark handled logistics with practiced efficiency, unloading supplies and checking lists. Lucas lingered, asking me about the drive, about my work, about things that suggested he was genuinely listening. I noticed the difference immediately, and I hated myself for noticing at all. Lucas was in his early 30s, calm in a way that felt earned rather than effortless. He spoke slowly, choosing words with care, and he had the habit of holding eye contact just a moment longer than necessary. Mark, by contrast, was brisk and grounded, his affection expressed through responsibility rather than language. They functioned well as a unit, and nothing about them appeared broken. That was important. I told myself that repeatedly. The campsite sat beside a narrow river, the sound of water threading through everything we did. Daniel busied himself with setting up tents, narrating his actions as if we were children who needed instruction. Mark joined him without comment. Lucas and I stood nearby, passing stakes back and forth, sharing small observations about the weather and the quiet. It was nothing. It was also the first time in weeks that I felt fully present in my own body. That evening, as the fire settled into a steady glow, conversation drifted toward safer subjects. Daniel talked about work frustrations. Mark complained mildly about city traffic. Lucas asked me why I lived alone. The question landed harder than it should have. I answered honestly, saying I preferred the quiet, leaving out how often that quiet felt like a verdict. Lucas nodded, as if he understood something I had not said aloud. Over the next day, patterns emerged. Mark rose early, focused on plans and timing. Daniel followed his lead. Lucas lingered over coffee, content to sit and watch the river before speaking. When our paths aligned, conversation followed naturally. He asked about my childhood, my mother, the choices that led me where I was. I realized I was offering more than I usually did, not because he pressed, but because he made space that I was careful with my thoughts, or at least I believed I was. I reminded myself that Lucas was taken, that Mark was kind, that Daniel trusted us all implicitly. Still, I began to anticipate moments when Lucas would be nearby, when his attention would settle on me without distraction. It was not desire in any obvious sense. It was recognition, and it stirred something dangerously close to hope. On the second afternoon, Daniel and Mark hiked ahead to scout a trail, leaving Lucas and me behind to prepare lunch. The task was simple and brief, yet I felt an inexplicable tightening in my chest. We worked in silence for a while, until Lucas mentioned that Mark had been distant lately, not unkind, just elsewhere. He said it without accusation, as if stating a weather report. I responded with something neutral, but the admission stayed with me. That night, after Daniel had gone to bed and Mark retired early, Lucas remained by the fire. I joined him, telling myself there was no reason not to. We talked quietly, about nothing urgent, about books we had read and places we had almost visited. The darkness pressed in around us, and the river kept moving, indifferent to the weight gathering in my thoughts. The following morning arrived too quickly, light seeping through the thin fabric of the tent. I woke with the lingering sense that I had dreamed something important and then misplaced it. At breakfast, Mark laughed easily at one of Daniel's stories, and Lucas smiled along, but there was a slight delay before his expression reached his eyes. I noticed it, and again I told myself that noticing meant nothing. As the day unfolded, I became acutely aware of my own restraint. I measured my words, adjusted my posture, kept my gaze appropriately distant. The effort was exhausting. Lucas spoke freely, occasionally brushing past me as we moved through narrow spaces, each accidental contact leaving an echo that lasted longer than it should have. In the afternoon, clouds gathered, heavy and slow, and the air turned still. We sat together under a tarp while rain fell in soft sheets. Daniel dozed. Mark scrolled through his phone, absorbed. Lucas leaned closer to speak over the sound, his voice low and steady. He asked if I was happy. I gave a careful answer, something about being content enough. He did not challenge it, but his expression suggested he heard the distance between my words and the truth. When the rain eased, Mark suggested an early night. As we dispersed, Lucas paused beside me, his tone casual, his eyes searching. He thanked me for the conversation, said it was good to talk to someone who listened. I replied in kind, aware that the exchange carried more weight than it deserved. As he turned away, a quiet certainty settled in my chest. This was no longer just a trip. It was the beginning of something I did not yet know how to name, and I was already afraid of where it might lead. That I lay awake that night, listening to the river, understanding that silence itself had shifted, and that whatever followed would demand more courage than I possessed at that moment. Morning arrived without ceremony. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets rinsed and reflective, and the quiet in Lucas's apartment felt deliberate, as if it had been negotiated overnight. I woke before him, or perhaps he had never slept at all. I lay still on the couch, cataloging the weight of what I had acknowledged and the absence of what I had not done. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like standing on a threshold with no map. Lucas stirred eventually and offered a careful greeting, his voice neutral, respectful. We moved through the small rituals of departure, coffee poured, keys located, without revisiting the night. When I left, he hugged me briefly, a gesture that was neither intimate nor distant, and said he hoped I'd get home safe. I promised I would. The promise felt symbolic, and insufficient. Madeline noticed the difference immediately. She always did. I came home quieter, my answers trimmed of warmth. She asked about the storm, about work, about the weekend ahead, and I answered honestly where I could and vaguely where I couldn't. The space between us expanded, not from anger but from omission. I began to realize how much of our life together depended on the assumption that I was whole and unconflicted. Over the following days, Lucas pulled back. Our conversations returned to work, efficient and public. He didn't ignore me, but he no longer offered the attentive silences that had drawn me in. I felt the loss acutely, more than I expected, and that frightened me. I had told myself the night was an anomaly, a moment of confusion, but confusion didn't linger like this. It didn't rearrange priorities or make absence feel like deprivation. Ryan asked if everything was okay, his tone casual but his eyes searching. I deflected with humor, then regretted it. The truth felt heavier with every person who didn't know it. I began to understand Lucas's earlier words about exhaustion, about the cost of being hidden. I was hiding from everyone, including myself, and it was wearing me thin. The confrontation with Madeline wasn't dramatic. It was quieter, which made it harder to endure. She asked why I seemed elsewhere even when I was sitting beside her. She asked if there was someone else, and the question landed between us with devastating clarity. I could have denied it in a technical sense. I could have argued semantics. Instead, I told her I had crossed a line emotionally, that I had let myself care in a way that threatened what we had built. Madeline listened, her composure steady until it wasn't. She didn't ask for names or details. She asked why. I told her the truth as best I could, without excuses or self-pity. I told her I didn't know who I was anymore, and that I was sorry for discovering it at her expense. The apology felt inadequate, but it was the only honest thing I had left to offer. The engagement ended not with a decision but with an understanding. We both recognized that continuing would require a denial neither of us deserved. Packing up my things felt surreal, a dismantling of a future that had once felt inevitable. I carried the guilt with me, aware that self-discovery did not absolve harm. Lucas and I didn't speak for weeks after that. The distance was necessary, a pause that allowed consequences to settle. When we finally met again, it was by chance, in a coffee shop we had both frequented long before any of this. He looked the same and different, familiar and newly guarded. We talked cautiously, acknowledging the damage without assigning blame. He told me he wouldn't be a secret, not again. I told him I understood, and meant that too. Time did what time does. It dulled the sharpest edges without erasing the shape of what had happened. I began to live more deliberately, questioning assumptions I had once accepted without thought. I learned that identity wasn't something you declared once and defended forever. It was something you discovered through attention and honesty, often at a cost. When Lucas and I chose to try again, it was without illusion. There were no grand promises, only an agreement to be visible and accountable. We moved slowly, aware that trust rebuilt itself in increments. Some nights, the weight of the past pressed close, reminding me of what I had lost and whom I had hurt. Other nights, the quiet felt earned. That I don't frame that night as a turning point because it didn't transform me overnight. It revealed me, and revelation is only the beginning. The line I crossed wasn't about orientation or labels. It was about truth. And once I saw it clearly, there was no returning to the certainty I had worn like armor. There was only the ongoing work of becoming honest, one choice at a time, and the knowledge that some nights change everything not by what happens, but by what can no longer be denied. The rain never came, but the threat of it lingered in the air when morning broke. Ethan woke before Daniel this time, the tent heavy with unsaid things. He lay still, listening to Daniel's breathing, steady and distant, and understood that whatever clarity he had hoped for would not arrive gently. They packed in silence. Each task was performed with care, as though precision could prevent further damage. Daniel folded the tent methodically, his jaw set, his focus unwavering. Ethan handed him stakes and ropes, resisting the urge to speak simply to fill the quiet. The absence of words felt earned now, a consequence rather than an accident. When the truck was loaded, Daniel leaned against it and finally met Ethan's eyes. The look held apology without confession, affection without permission. "We should talk," Daniel said, voice low, as if the forest itself might overhear. They sat on a fallen log, the campsite already losing its shape around them. Daniel took a breath that seemed to cost him something. "What happened here matters," he began. "That's the problem." He paused, choosing honesty over comfort. "I let myself lean on you in ways I shouldn't have. That's on me." Ethan felt relief and loss arrive together. "I didn't stop it," he said. "I wanted to feel important." The admission stung, but it felt necessary. He watched Daniel absorb the words, watched responsibility settle where defensiveness might have lived. "You are important," Daniel replied, quickly, then steadied himself. "Just not like this. Not to me. Not when it risks hurting people who didn't choose this." Rebecca's name still wasn't spoken, but it didn't need to be. The truth of her presence threaded through Daniel's words, anchoring them. Ethan nodded, understanding that accountability could coexist with care, even if it couldn't save what had formed between them. The drive home was quieter than the ride out. The radio stayed off. Fields returned to buildings, and the world resumed its edges. At a stoplight, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then set it face down without answering. Ethan noticed the restraint and recognized it as a decision. Near Ethan's apartment, Daniel slowed the truck. He turned, hesitation breaking through his composure. "I don't regret coming," he said. "I regret not setting better boundaries sooner." Ethan appreciated the distinction. "I don't regret learning what I needed to learn," he replied. It felt like a farewell without finality, honest without cruelty. They stood on the sidewalk longer than necessary. Daniel offered a brief, careful hug, appropriate, deliberate. Ethan returned it, understanding the meaning in its limits. When Daniel pulled away, the space between them felt newly defined. Days passed. Life resumed its rhythm, but Ethan moved through it changed. He met Lucas Reed for coffee and listened more than he spoke, recognizing how easily attention could be mistaken for intimacy. At night, he thought about the forest, about the way feelings could grow in quiet places if left unattended. Daniel kept his distance. When he did reach out, it was measured, respectful. He asked how Ethan was doing and accepted simple answers. Ethan sensed that Daniel was choosing his marriage, not as an obligation, but as an act of repair. Weeks later, Ethan received a message from Daniel. I told Rebecca I need to be more present. We're working on it. There was no request hidden in the words, no invitation to resume what had ended. Ethan replied with encouragement and meant it. That evening, Ethan walked alone through a nearby park. The air was cool, familiar. He thought about how closeness could reveal needs without fulfilling them, how attraction could illuminate rather than consume. He understood now that restraint wasn't denial, it was direction. As the sun dipped below the trees, Ethan felt a quiet resolve take shape. The weekend had not given him a romance to keep, but it had given him clarity. He carried that forward, aware that some stories ended not with declarations, but with decisions, and that choosing differently was its own kind of beginning.